Great, so I'll be moderating the panel. Thank you all for being here. So a little bit of background on me. I'm also doing a PhD in philosophy in addition to doing a bunch of EA stuff, so I'm really excited to moderate a panel with all of these great people. One of the questions I thought I'd ask first, which is kind of for everybody, is, more philosophers often get the question, like, why does the work that you're doing matter? And so what I wanted to ask for everybody in the panel is, what's like a hot topic in philosophy right now where the answer to that question can like directly affect things that EAs are doing? So if that makes sense, maybe we'll just start with Hilary and kind of go down the line for what you think like sort of the hottest topic is that would change what EAs might work on.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So my answer to that, the one I'm most directly familiar with, is the one that I already mentioned in my talk earlier. I think that population ethics can make a massive difference to a significant proportion of the things that we should worry about as EAs. In particular, the thing that gives rise to this is the situation where at the moment we have lots of moral philosophers who really like their ivory tower abstract theorizing. Those people have done a lot of discussing this abstract question of, okay, what's the right theory of population ethics? Then at the real world extreme, we have lots of people engaging directly with the real world issues, thinking, okay, how should we do our cost-benefit analysis for example, family planning? But we have a big gap in the middle. We don't really have a well-developed community of people who are both in touch with the background moral philosophy and who are interested in applying it to the real world. So because there's that gap, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit at the moment for people who have a background in moral philosophy but are also plugged into the EA community to build these bridges from theory to practice and say what it all means for the real world.
Well, I actually agree with that population ethics is an important area that does connect, and just another place that connects from what Hilary was talking about earlier is for the existential risk questions, because we need to think about, suppose that the world were destroyed, is what's so bad about that the fact that 7.5 billion people have lost their lives and that's the end of them, or is it the loss of the untold billions of people? I think Nick Bostrom has sort of 10 to the 56th or something, is it? I don't know, some vastly unimaginable number of possible future lives that could have been good and that would be lost. So that seems to me to be a real issue. If you want to be something that's a little more sort of nitty-gritty in what we're talking about today, another issue I think is how do we get a grip on the nature and extent of animal suffering? Something I'll be talking about a bit in a moment, but it's really very hard to say. David just talked about factory farming and the vast amount of billions of animals suffering in factory farms, and I totally agree that that is a top priority issue. But in terms of assessing priorities, how do we compare the suffering of a chicken in a factory farm to the suffering of, let's say, a mother who has to watch her child dying of malaria? Is there some way we can get a better handle on that?
Yeah, for me, I think one of the key issues in ethics at the moment that bears on effective altruism is what's known as a situationist critique of virtue ethics. So trying to understand not only how having a better character helps people to act well, but also what environment they're in and the kind of subtle environmental influences that might either support or subvert a person acting well, and in particular having the virtue perhaps of liberality. So there's lots of interesting research being done on that. Some people think that debate's starting to die down, but seems to be just starting up again with a couple of new books that have come out looking at a new twist on that. So for me, I'm keen to do that. I guess in my own work at Monash, I teach a lot of health professionals, so keen to look at what environmental influences there are on doctors that impede them having a therapeutic relationship with patients, not only thinking about how to help them be more virtuous, I suppose, which is not the only thing I aim to do with the doctors that I teach, but at least hope to have that kind of influence to some extent.
Yes, well, I'm slightly out of touch now with analytic philosophy, but one issue that I haven't really seen tackled yet by analytic philosophy is this disguised implication of classical utilitarianism of what we ought to be doing, which is essentially optimizing matter and energy throughout the world and eventually perhaps throughout the accessible universe for maximum bliss. A questioner earlier was asking, well, as a negative utilitarian, do you accept this apparent counterintuitive consequence that one ought to wipe out the world to prevent the suffering of one person? But if one is a classical utilitarian, then it seems to be a disguised consequence that it's not good enough to aim merely for a civilization in which all sentient beings can flourish or enjoy gradients of intelligent bliss. Instead, one must go on remorselessly to matter and energy is nothing but pure orgasmic bliss.
I find remorseless an unusual term to describe it.
Well, I think this is actually rather an appealing idea to me, but I know not everyone shares this intuition.
So, Peter, I'd be interested in knowing if you have thoughts on whether that's an implication of classical utilitarianism.
If I accept that implication?
Yeah.
Well, Dave and I talked about this a little bit earlier in the lunch break. I guess maybe I accept it, but I have difficulty in grasping what it is to talk about converting matter and energy into bliss, unless we assume that there are conscious minds that are going to be experiencing this bliss. And of course then David would very strongly agree that these conscious minds have to not only experience the bliss, but they have to not experience anything, any suffering certainly, and presumably minimize anything that they experience other than bliss, because that's not converting the matter and energy into bliss. So if what I'm being asked to imagine is a universe with a vast number of conscious minds all experiencing bliss, yeah, maybe I do accept that implication.
So this is a question mostly for Justin, but I'd be interested in other people's thoughts as well. So effective altruists often talked about doing the most good. It seems like you're committed to thinking that EA shouldn't do the most good, they should do maybe enough good. I'm wondering if that's an implication of the views you hold.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. One of the things I didn't really emphasise in my talk on virtue ethics is that standardly virtue ethics thinks that we should strive to be an excellent human being, which can fall a little way short of being, producing the maximum good. Or so if you sort of, produce an excellent level of liberality or of perhaps good or benefit to someone else, then that's enough for virtue. Yeah, and I guess in some of the examples I was giving in my talk, where you might choose a partner who, although you're not the ultimate power couple, but you are the suboptimal power couple, but you're nonetheless attracted to that other person, very strongly, that from the perspective of effective altruism, it might sound like you're doing the wrong thing, but I think intuitively it doesn't seem to be wrong. That might be perhaps one example of the kind of thing you asked about.
Any other thoughts on that question?
Sure, yeah. So maybe I could say a bit about what the similarity looks like from a more consequentialist perspective. When people think of consequentialism, they sometimes assume that consequentialists think there's a moral imperative to maximize, that you absolutely have to do the most good, and anything less than that is wrong. But it's worth emphasizing that not all consequentialists emphasize that at all. Not all consequentialists think it's even helpful to buy into this language of right and wrong. So you don't have to be a virtue ethicist in order to feel somewhat alienated from a moral imperative to do the absolute most good. You could just think something like the following: never mind right and wrong, never mind what I should versus I'm not allowed to be doing. I might just want to make the world better, and I might just think I can order all the things I could possibly do in terms of better and worse. And then, if I give away 1% of my income, that's better than giving away nothing. If I give 5%, that's better than giving away 1%. If I give away 50%, that's better than anything less. But I don't have to impose some sharp cutoff and say that I'm doing something morally wrong if I do less than that. I think if we think in this way, then we tend to alienate both ourselves and other people less, because there's something very alienating about holding up a very high standard and then saying that anybody, including yourself, who falls short of that very high standard is doing something wrong with a capital R.
Can I say something? So, in a way, I agree. You're talking about a spectrum view of where we have a spectrum from black to white, or maybe we don't want to use those terms for it, but anyway, from one end to the other, and you're somewhere on the spectrum, and you try and work your way further up the spectrum, perhaps. Which, yeah, I'm reasonably comfortable with that. Another way of looking at it, and this goes back to something that Sidgwick also said, is that we ought to be clearer about distinguishing when we regard an act as the right act rather than the wrong act, and when we regard it as appropriate to praise or blame people for doing it. And these are really separate things, especially if you are a consequentialist, because praising or blaming someone is an act, and you only ought to do that if it will have good consequences. So suppose that we think that somebody in a particular person's circumstances ought to be giving 50% of his earnings away, but he's only giving 10%. But he's living in a society like ours in which, by giving 10%, he's at the top 99.99% of what people are giving. Well, to sort of blame him for saying, oh, you're only giving 10%, you should be giving more, looks like it's going to be very counterproductive, and really want to praise him in front of other people so that more people will give 10%. So I think if we understand it that way, that's another way of looking at it. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily better than the sort of spectrum view that you were suggesting, but it is another way of, if you like, softening this black-white sort of morality idea that it's either right or it's wrong.
So this is a question for Hilary. You mentioned that one might find the uncertainty that your talk generates kind of paralyzing, but you mentioned that wasn't your conclusion. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on why that's not the conclusion. Like maybe we should just give up on the whole EA project because we don't know what's actually going to work.
Okay, sure. So I mean, three possible reactions occur to me when I come up against this kind of issue that, in my mind, cast serious doubt on what are the best causes to be donating to. Reaction number one is to say, all right, I throw up my hands, I give up on effective altruism, I'm just going to keep my income for myself. Reaction number two says, oh dear, this casts serious doubt in my mind over, it reduces from something close to 1 to something maybe even less than half my credences regarding which are the best causes to be donating to. However, reaction number two says, well, I'm still going to donate to the ones in which I currently have the highest credence that those are the best things to do. And then I'll keep pursuing my research and maybe I'll start donating to different things in the future. Or there's a third possibility which says, oh, okay, because I'm currently sufficiently uncertain about which are the best causes, I don't currently feel confident donating to AMF or family planning or any other particular thing in that ballpark. But there's another thing I could donate to. I could donate to think tanks that go on figuring these things out, and then hopefully in a few years' time we'll get to the point where we have better advice on which of these things we should be donating to. And at that point we can switch away from the direction of think tanks and back towards things like health as it may be, or family planning as it may be, or existential risk as it may be, or whatever. So, I mean, my own perspective is I'm uncertain between two of those three things. Right? So I don't know whether the thing I should be doing right now is continuing to donate to things like AMF and SCI as recommended by GiveWell, and in the meantime continuing the research that might change those recommendations in the future, or not donating to AMF but giving all my money to the Global Priorities Project. I have some credence that each of those things might be right. The one thing I am sure of, though, is that I'm not going to do the most good in the world by keeping my money for myself and living in a bigger house and driving a faster car. That just seems to be clearly the bottom of the pile. So that's why I don't have the cynical reaction to the uncertainty.
Can I follow up? Because it's interesting that one of the options was continuing to donate to AMF. It wasn't continuing to donate to the family planning programs. So does that suggest that you don't really believe the sort of neo-Malthusian problems about population, about the dangers of larger population?
Okay, so no, the only reason that I gave the donating to the AMF and continuing the research as the example there is that has in fact been my personal decision. But another thing in that camp might be, okay, my current best guess is family planning at the moment, but I'll continue the research. I didn't mean to be breaking the symmetry between those two in that way.
So another option you might consider is just donating later. So you might think, well, better information in the future, so I should, put all of my money, I can maybe put it into some sort of tax-deductible vehicle and then donate it when we have better information. So is there a reason you've excluded that as an option?
No, I'm not sure that my current decision has been a rational one. These are issues that I find very difficult. I think what you're saying is a variant on my third suggestion. I mean, maybe you're not in the meantime plowing your money into research, but you're hoping that somebody else will do that so that the information will get there.
Okay. Great. So this is a question for Peter. So effective altruism has sometimes been criticized for focusing on incremental change and not on systematic change. I think you touched on this a little bit in your talk. I'm interested in whether you think that's a fair criticism or how EA should respond to that kind of worry.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways in which that question can be asked. One is as a sort of genuine question, saying, should I work for some organization that is trying to reform the world trade system, say, to make it fairer for poor countries? Or should I work to try to reduce climate change? And there I say, as I hinted at in the talk, if you've got a strategy that looks like, there's some chance, even quite a small chance, that you could contribute to making a difference on something as big as that, which would affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people for the better, then sure, EA can accept that. EA is about expected value. It doesn't say that the only thing you ought to do is to give to one of the charities that GiveWell is currently recommending as their top charities. I think we're more open and wider than that. But I do often find when I speak that I get a question that is a little bit really, I think, intended to challenge the whole idea in a different way. And that's basically saying, look, you're recommending people donate to private charities. Don't you realise that the real problem of the world is the global capitalist system, and that's what we need to change. And everything else is just a band-aid, or worse still, it's a distraction from what we ought to be doing. So my response to that is, in a way, it's still consistent with what I just said about the larger structural things. I want that person to tell me, firstly, what is the better alternative to global capitalism that he has in mind, and how does he know that will work better? And secondly, how do we get from where we are now to the overthrow of the global capitalist system? And whenever I've asked people to answer those questions, I don't get anything very coherent that even suggests how we might get there. So my response to that is, if you can't tell me something that gives me some chance of making a difference here, then given that we seem to be stuck with this global capitalist system, given that we can't even really be sure whether there is a better alternative, can't we get on with the present job of trying to reduce the amount of suffering and poverty and so on that exists within that?
Great, thank you. This is a question for David. So I think one thing that recently has really influenced effective altruist thinking is kind of crucial considerations. So one of the most influential ones is the astronomical stakes idea, that maybe helping improve the happy, healthy lives of future people maybe matters more than working on people in the present day. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on other crucial considerations that EAs could be looking at that they're currently missing, especially ones that you haven't already covered in your talk or elsewhere.
It's just that imagine if everything that everyone enjoys an extraordinarily high material standard of living, would the average subjective quality of life be radically higher than it was today or on the African savannah? And unfortunately, there is just very, very little evidence that this is the case. In that, for example, we are social primates, and so many of our preferences conflict with each other. Let's say, to use a relatively trivial example, something like football. Many people are fanatical about football. Most football teams are not going to win the World Cup. I have absolutely no idea how to reconcile people's competing preferences there. Likewise, so many goods and services. They are really about status goods and services. So once one has tackled the extremes of absolute poverty, where does one go? And this is back to the idea that the only long-term solution I know is hedonic recalibration, investigating the particular molecular mechanisms underlying the hedonic treadmill and recalibrating. Technically speaking, one can't say it's completely neutral. Otherwise, something like low mood and depression would never have evolved. But nonetheless, yes, you can make all, to use the example I just used, football supporters happier if they are temperamentally, their hedonic set point is set much higher. But, okay, that's a relatively trivial example, but you can generalize it to love, something desperately serious like that. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that question?
So let me get it right. You really think that life, say, in a reasonably affluent nation like Australia, is not on average better than life in the African savannah, or for that matter, life in medieval Europe or things of that sort? Yeah.
I mean, if one assumes something like suicide is an honest signal, then yes, suicide rates in much of the developed world are higher than in the undeveloped world, and the incidence of depression, anxiety disorders, so many forms of psychological distress. Now, no doubt there are lots of confounding variables too, but let's just take it at face value that study I cited earlier. Let's not, not adjusting for anything. How many people does one know that are on antidepressants who are unhappy, discontented, jealous, all of the spectrum of Darwinian emotions? What objective evidence is there that someone, traditional, on the African savannah, or an Indonesian peasant, is actually subjectively worse off in their quality of life? Now that can sound dangerously complacent. It's not meant to. I think one of the great priorities of the EA movement should be tackling global poverty. But looking towards the long term, if we're ethically serious about getting rid of suffering, whether depression, anxiety disorders, and malaise, we're going to have to tackle their genetic biological roots.
I think there's, I'm not totally disagreeing with you, and particularly, with that last point, but I would caution about putting too much weight either on suicide rates or on the answers that people give to questions like, how satisfied are you with life right now? And that applies both to the study with the Indonesian came on top and the study of people with quadriplegia or locked-in syndrome or other serious disabilities. It's certainly possible that what those people are doing is adjusting their expectations downwards. So they then say that they're quite satisfied or very satisfied with their life because they're comparing themselves against a baseline that's lower than the baseline of somebody who is living in Australia rather than Indonesia, or somebody who is able, fully able and healthy rather than with quadriplegia.
So there's a question for everybody on the panel. A number of EAs are in philosophy or considering on going into philosophy. If you were talking to somebody about that question, should marginal EAs go into philosophy, how would you answer that question? Or how would you know if you're the kind of person who should go into philosophy? So we can start with Hilary and kind of go down the line.
So firstly, this is just a really hard question, and I don't want to be pretending to be remotely authoritative about this. So here are just some thoughts that I think should form part of the thought process. Some people have a very pessimistic view of philosophy, and for those people, philosophy seems like a thoroughly self-indulgent career choice. So this is the picture where you think of the philosopher as the person who just spends all their time in a kind of process of mental masturbation, where it's all about just thinking about the things that you find really fun and exciting to think about, but completely cut off from the real world. So, the first thing to do if you're talking to someone who's got any part of that component is to disabuse them from the notion that philosophy has to be like that. It's true that there are some topics, philosophy is a very broad field. There are some topics you can pick within philosophy that, to a first approximation, are completely cut off from the real world and would not be the kind of thing that you'd want to do if you were thinking about it from an EA point of view. But those wouldn't be the kind of bits of philosophy you probably were even considering working on if you were approaching it from the EA point of view anyway. So I'm thinking about the bits of philosophy that are as far away as you can possibly get from moral philosophy. For example, I used to work on the philosophy of physics. I don't think that's going to improve the world. But if you're thinking about this, if you're asking yourself, should I be, say, focusing on movement growth? Should I be going and funding a charity startup? Or should I be working in moral philosophy? Then I think the issues are a lot more nuanced. As we've discussed a little bit earlier on the panel and in some of the talks, I think there are clear cases where having the time and space to learn the literature, think through the issues really carefully, get clear about the basics, and then bring those to bear on the real world, that is definitely one thing that the EA movement needs. So we do need some people making those contributions. As for which individuals should be the people to do that, I think it's probably a fair comment that unless you can get into one of the top graduate programs in philosophy, then you're probably not high up enough in the profession to be very well placed to make that particular kind of contribution. That would be my one tentative remark there. So when I have students asking me that kind of question, I sometimes say, well, look, go and apply for the top graduate schools. If you get in, that's an indication that this might be a good career path. If you can't get into one of the good places, then your comparative advantage maybe lies elsewhere.
I certainly have advised people on this question, and Matt Wagga, who I showed, was one of my students who came to talk to me about it, and obviously you saw where he ended up. I wasn't, and I did not try to persuade him to go into philosophy, even though he was accepted by Oxford for graduate study. But Matt is a somewhat special case. Because of the math background he had, it was easy for him to get a very well-paid position straight out of his undergraduate degree. That's certainly not true for everyone. He was pretty sure that he could resist the blandishments of the lifestyle of his co-workers, and he hasn't gone and bought himself a Porsche or anything like that. So, that's another requirement, I think. Would he have made a really important contribution to philosophy? It's very hard to say. But it's certainly true that there are a lot of very bright people trying to go into philosophy, and increasingly, thanks to the EA movement, they are going into those areas of philosophy that Hilary just mentioned, where they're more likely to do some good than some of the other areas. So if you're thinking about the marginal difference that you can make, I do think it's relevant to look at what the other opportunities are. One other thing that I would mention, though, is that you can also contribute not just by doing breakthrough research, but by teaching. And so it might be that you can't get into one of the top graduate schools, but you also can't get the sort of instant six-figure salary by going to Wall Street or something like that. Teaching these areas of philosophy that are important and make a difference, really can make a difference. I mean, I talk in my book about the day I got an email from a guy called Chris Croy, who I'd never heard of, who was at Merrimack Community College, I think it was, which is a lower ranking, the community colleges in the US are the lower area of the system. I'd never heard of Merrimack either. But because of a discussion in his class of my Famine, Affluence and Morality article plus a response, he had ended up donating a kidney to a stranger. Because his community college professor had assigned those readings, he had led to think about what he could do altruistically, and had donated this kidney, which clearly did some good. In fact, he's one of the cases where he got a phone call one day where somebody on the end of the line said, "This is your kidney calling." And it turned out that this was a guy in his 40s who had been very disabled by kidney disease and was teaching in a school for disadvantaged kids. So, he was doing good as well. So, I think we shouldn't write off the value that you can have through teaching too.
I think I would agree with Peter, certainly about the teaching. If you are looking for areas to have that impact, obviously applied ethics is one of them. There's different sort of areas within applied ethics, but I mean, if you think of the sort of thing I do, the doctors and the other health professionals who come and do the Master of Bioethics, often they just want to be able to think more clearly about what they do. And, as far as I can tell in the way they apply it, it's not just about being able to live with themselves, but it's being able to use critical thinking much better to be able to make sure that they are actually serving the proper goals of medicine, which is to improve patient health. So, you mightn't think of that as the always the most exemplary form of altruism, but it's obviously, preventing a lot of harm and doing a lot of good. Just to give you an example of that, one of the master's graduates that we taught, and I don't take any personal credit for this, was Tony Hoffman, who was the whistleblower at Bundaberg Base Hospital in 2005 and was Australian of the Year Local Hero in 2006. And I was interested to ask her, after she did the Master of Bioethics course, she did it as a distance education student, what difference did it make that you had, this training in ethics? And because I didn't think, it would take that sort of training in ethics to be able to spot that the surgeon that she became the whistleblower for, who actually just got out of jail here in Australia a few months ago, Jayant Patel, it doesn't take postgraduate training in ethics to realise that this guy was not competent at the sort of surgery that he was doing. So I asked her that question, and she said, well, people took me a bit more seriously because I said that I had this postgraduate training in ethics, and it was easier for me to get something done to stop this guy from doing his operations. So, it's maybe not one of these sorts of examples you use in effective altruism, but I think, pretty clearly she saved a number of lives in the process. In terms of research, one of the exciting things for me, and I'm sure, for some of you as well, that when you do research in applied ethics is the chance to do some empirical research. And so the opportunity to not just sit in the office by yourself and reflect and try to make one's ideas more consistent and more kind of rational and defensible, but also to see what are the real problems out there that we actually need to work on, where a bit of critical thinking can make a difference. And finally, I'd say that I agree with a comment that Derek Parfit made more than 30 years ago, which is that the era of secular ethics is only just in its infancy, and I think that there's a lot more good that critical thinking can do. And so I'm not saying I would encourage all of you with an interest in philosophy to go down that path, but I think that there's just vast opportunities to do good for the world through philosophy.
Yes, just to follow up there, I think it's very easy to be scornful of philosophy, but by not studying any philosophy, one hasn't somehow transcended it. The risk is that one simply gives bad philosophical assumptions a free pass. And that, there's this question, is it possible to be, other than by chance, an effective altruist without actually understanding the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, mind, and the mind-body problem? I mean, let's say 600 years ago, what's the, one can imagine the kind of counterpart of the effective and the ineffective altruist. The effective altruist, let's say, the inquisitor who knows that the heretic is doomed for an eternity of torture in hell. The ethical thing to do, if that is your conception of the world, is to, torture them for a few hours or days, because that will save their soul from an eternity of torment, whereas the ineffective altruist just uses verbal persuasion. Now, okay, hopefully today our dilemmas aren't quite so severe, and yet, nonetheless, in some sense, we do need to, understand the fundamental nature of reality, understand the theoretical upper bounds of rational agency. The question of philosophy of physics was touched on earlier, but we need to understand, for example, if sentient life has evolved within our Hubble volume, in which case presumably our responsibilities could in theory extend beyond the solar system. Other topics, if it were to transpire that something like the Everett interpretation were true, how should one behave as an effective altruist? Ultimately, I think it may well be the case that we need to develop a superintelligence, full-spectrum superintelligence, to maximize the capacity of intelligent agency to do good in the world. So, yes, I would urge anyone, where possible, to study philosophy, but also, read as broadly as possible. One very critical skill, of course, given one can't be a master of everything, is try to learn who the experts are, which, of course, itself can be quite challenging. Much more to be said, but of course.
I think that's all the time we have. Can we thank our panel?